Welcome back. We've now reached the halfway point of this course, so it might be an appropriate moment to pause and take stock of what's happening in each of the main regions that we've been following. Around the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea, in India and in China, we've traced events up to around 200 BC. In all of these areas, brief-lived but geographically vast empires have collapsed and have left behind confused political landscapes. Alexander the Great's huge empire has fragmented into the many kingdoms established by his generals. In China, after the death of Shi Huangdi, his planned dynasty that would last for 1,000 generations, in practice turned out to survive for 2. And unified China has disintegrated back into little warring kingdoms. Finally, in India, the temporary unification of the country by Chandragupta and Asoka ended with the death of the last Mauryan king in 184 BC. And India, likewise, has splintered into lots of little kingdoms. And here in India, the resulting plethora of small, constantly warring states will become the normal situation for hundreds of years, and no conqueror and no giant empire will emerge for nearly 600 years, until finally the Gupta Empire would unite northern and central India. In China and the Mediterranean, however, something very different would take place. Beginning around 200 BC, in both those regions, a single political power would emerge that not only would unite that whole region under its control, but also, maybe even more impressively, would establish a stable empire that would last for at least 4 centuries. These two successful, long-lasting regimes are the Roman Empire and the Han Empire. And not only do these two empires exist at right about the same time, and they endure for roughly the same length of time, but they're also approximately the same size in terms of both population and geographic extent. So because of the many similarities and parallels between the Han and the Roman empires, they're well worth examining together. Since the Han Empire follows directly after the actions of Shi Huangdi and either perpetuates or sometimes reacts against many of his policies, I'll first give a brief overview of the Han dynasty. Now, in cultural and intellectual terms, there's a lot of continuity between the Han and the previous Chinese dynasties. And since we've already looked at those aspects of Chinese culture, in this lecture, I'll really just concentrate on outlining Han political history. Then we will shift our focus to a new geographic region that we've not yet explored in this course, the Western Mediterranean, and it's from there that Roman civilization will arise. And since Rome represents a completely new civilization from a completely new region, and is also a culture that will exert a great deal of influence, we'll stick with the Romans for 5 lectures, following their development all the way from its earliest stages up until the high point of the Roman Empire in the 2nd century AD. And then, having outlined the history of these 2 great contemporary empires, one of the East and one of the West, I'll pause in the narrative to spend a couple lectures explicitly comparing and contrasting certain key aspects of Han and Roman civilization. And some of these aspects, I think, help to explain their success, their longevity, and their lasting fame. All right, that's the plan for the next 10 lectures or so. Let's get started. In China, after Qin Shi Huangdi's death in 210 BC, things rapidly go downhill. His son could not control the various power struggles among his advisors and ends up ruling in an even more oppressive and heavy-handed manner than his father had. The common people are completely tired of the heavy tax load, of the forced labor, and the really harsh legal system that's been imposed. The intellectuals and the upper classes, they're stewing with resentment at their treatment, and the treasury has been drained by all the giant public works projects. The country begins to erupt in rebellions by different factions, some led by aristocrats who want to regain their former power and reestablish old-style feudalism, and some rebellions are led by peasants who are just hoping to gain some freedom. After several confused years, one of these rebel leaders, named Liu Bang, rises out of the chaos to found a new dynasty, the Han. The name, by the way, comes from a tributary of the Yangtze River. Liu Bang is really an extremely unlikely candidate to become the next emperor and to establish what will turn out to be one of China's most influential dynasties. Liu Bang was a peasant who, at least when he was younger, was described as being lazy, uneducated, and unemployed. Furthermore, he had a reputation that he was a bit overly fond of wine and women. But despite that seemingly unpromising beginning, he reformed his ways, became the headman of his local village, and from there became a general in one of the armies of rebellious peasants. Even then, his skills as a general weren't very good. He lost every single battle that he personally commanded except one. But his real talent lay in knowing how to choose subordinates, how to delegate authority, and how to mediate among his various followers who didn't get along very well. And it's these, what we might call people skills, that allowed him to hold together unlikely alliances. And eventually, he was able to command the allegiance of all these different subordinates. And that was enough to elevate him to the emperorship and to enable him to rule successfully once he got there. Liu Bang is one of only two individuals in the whole long history of China who rose all the way from peasant to emperor. Now, because he was illiterate, he had to rely heavily on scholars in the bureaucracy. And he retained a certain peasant's contempt for what he saw as these overly effete men of abstract learning. One story, for example, told about him says that sometimes he would grab the distinctive hat which was worn by scholars and rip it off their heads and then urinate in it as a sign of his contempt for them. Nevertheless, he understood how to use those bureaucrats to his advantage. And this uneducated commoner brought about a period that, at least later, would be viewed as almost a golden age of Chinese culture and civilization. In later times, the Chinese would continue to call themselves men of Han or sons of Han, because this was respected as the greatest dynasty, which established the model that all later dynasties followed. Liu Bang's cleverness in establishing a stable form of government lay in keeping the strong centralized state that Shi Huangdi had built, but adding to it or turning it into a somewhat kinder, gentler form. So he attempted to combine the Confucian model of the compassionate, virtuous ruler who cared about his subjects with the efficiency and the order of legalism. He addressed the unhappiness of the peasants by reducing the forced labor that was required of them, and at least for a while, reducing taxes. He got the intellectuals and the educated upper classes on his side by rescinding the Qin ban on Confucian and Zhou classics. And he actively encouraged intellectual pursuits instead of suppressing them. All of this resulted in a flowering or a renaissance of intellectual life in China. Liu Bang found ways to harness the talents of the class of educated men and turn those towards the service of the state. And he did this by establishing a system that was both highly ordered and hierarchical, but not hereditary. And this is essential, because rather than offering advancement based on birth, instead, this system rewarded those who had skills and energy. And the actual mechanism by which you identified these people was through an elaborate system of examinations. And the exams were based on your knowledge of Confucian classic texts. So, aspiring civil servants could take these exams, and if they did well on them, they could rise in the bureaucracy based on their intellectual and their organizational abilities. China was divided up into 100 governmental regions, and these were further subdivided into 1,500 districts. A very elaborate, multi-layered bureaucracy was formed which had 20 different levels. And it's been estimated that there were 130,000 individuals working in this bureaucracy and overseeing everything from the collection of taxes to the building of public works. The Han rulers also set up a national university, which eventually would enroll 30,000 students. And they were there studying to pass those civil service exams and try and do well at them. In theory, the exam system purely rewarded merit. And so, again, it should allow poor people to overcome their origins. Now, in practice, the system did naturally favor sons from the wealthier landowning families, because they were the ones who had more wealth and time to devote themselves to the study which was necessary. But nevertheless, it did serve as a way to identify the most gifted and the most industrious. Whereas before, the main social division had been a rigid distinction between peasant and aristocrat, now it was a more fluid line between peasant and sort of landowner bureaucrat. While the Han did away with the hated Qin restrictions on travel, books, and even thought, they did continue some Qin policies, such as conscription into the army. They also continued the use of forced labor to build especially canals and roads. And they continued the standardization of things such as weights, measures, and currency, and the Chinese script. The Han dynasty would last about 4 centuries, from 202 BC to 220 AD. But that Han fusion of legalism and Confucianism, mingling practicality and ethics, would become the model for all subsequent Chinese dynasties. And it really set the pattern for government that would endure for about 1,500 years in China. Liu Bang's immediate heirs, as well as later Han emperors, continued to follow the precedent that he had established of the benevolent Confucian ruler. But by the time we get to later Han emperors, such as Wu Ti, who came to power in 141 BC, that balance began to shift a little bit back towards the more centralized and heavy-handed model of Qin rule. Wu Ti, who ruled down until 87 BC, was known as the martial emperor because he pursued a very aggressive policy of military expansion. And under him, China would expand to its largest extent during the Han period. He also favored a more powerful, centralized sort of government in which a lot of different industries, including things like iron making, salt collection, copper, even liquor, were taken over by the state, which would control them as monopolies. He also actively regulated the food supply. He set up something that was called the ever-normal granary system, in which the government would buy up big quantities of grain in years that there was a good harvest, they would store it up, and then they would sell it for sort of subsidized, lower than market prices during years in which there were bad harvests. And this is an early attempt at government regulation of prices. And it didn't wholly work. It wasn't entirely successful. But it does, I think, demonstrate a concern for preventing starvation among the empire's populace. And to support his big and active military, under Wu Ti, taxes were steadily raised. With all the resources of China to draw upon, Wu Ti was able to put together huge armies, sometimes more than 100,000 soldiers. And he sent these off in various directions. Towards the south, in what today is northern Vietnam, that area was brought under Chinese control at this time. He also conquered southern Manchuria and Korea, and he kept pushing the borders of China to the west out into Central Asia. His biggest challenge, though, was to the north, where repeatedly he would mount expeditions against the nomads of the steppe who lived in that region. The main enemy among these various nomads was a confederation of tribes known as the Xiongnu. They were fierce warriors who fought always from horseback, and currently there's a big debate among scholars, some of whom would like to identify the Xiongnu with the people later known as the Huns. Now, it's not really sure if the Huns and the Xiongnu are actually the same group, but whether they were or not, they were very similar in lifestyle and the sort of tactics that they used in warfare. And they're true nomads, so they do not establish any permanent cities or camps. They only have sort of temporary settlements, and they specialize in being horse archers, and they were absolutely deadly shooting their arrows from horseback. The famous Chinese historian Sima Qian wrote a description of them. And in this description, he describes them as being, "They are people who move about in search of water and pasture, and they have no walled cities or fixed dwellings, nor do they engage in any form of agriculture. Even the little boys start out learning to ride sheep and to shoot birds and rats with a bow and arrow. Their only concern is self-advantage, and they know nothing of propriety or righteousness." Wu Ti mounted a number of very expensive campaigns against the Xiongnu. But since there were no cities to attack, no real territory to conquer, he couldn't pin the nomads down, and they would simply ride away if they didn't feel like fighting the Han armies. In the words of the frustrated Han generals, they said that the Xiongnu move about on swift horses, and in their breasts beat the hearts of beasts. They shift from place to place like a flock of birds. Thus, it is difficult to corner them and to bring them under control. Despite their evasiveness, Wu Ti does eventually manage to drive the Xiongnu out of Chinese territory. And he tried to keep them out by establishing a series of fortified outposts and sort of little garrison towns all along the northern frontier of China. And these efforts were, again, only partly successful, and there are constant raids and incursions from these barbarian groups. And these sorts of raids will be really a recurrent theme all throughout Han and indeed into later Chinese history. Just like under Shi Huangdi, however, the people eventually grew tired of Wu Ti's constant military campaigns, which ended up depleting the resources, depleting the treasury of the Chinese Empire. But then, instead of responding like Shi Huangdi with even greater repression, Wu Ti did something really unusual. He actually apologized, and he changed his behavior and his policies. So he issued an edict in which he expressed regret for his past mistakes, and in which he promised that he would be a better ruler in the future. True to his word, he halted expansionism and warfare in favor of spending the rest of his life promoting things like agriculture and trade. So in the north, for example, instead of funding more military expeditions, Wu Ti built a canal connecting the Yellow River to the original Han capital of Chang'an. And so by doing so, he really linked up two important regions and fostered economic activity within China. And during the Han period, trade and commerce thrive, both as a result of government policies and due to the security and the safety and the stability which had been brought by the state. One of the most significant aspects of the Han economy was the silk trade. Silk is produced by little worms, and the fabric which is made from them was a Chinese monopoly, which was coveted not only within China, but among all the civilizations that become exposed to it. And in particular, the cultures of the Near East and the Mediterranean very, very quickly developed a taste for this luxury good once they knew of it. And the result was the establishment of the famous Silk Road, which linked China with the world outside and which extended across all of Asia to Europe. Now, the origins of the particular route probably go back quite a bit, all the way maybe to the time of the Zhou dynasty. But it was under the Han that it became much more prominent, and that regular caravans started to go back and forth. These caravans would load up with silk and begin in China. Then they would go to Central Asia, where the goods would have to be transferred from horses to these Bactrian camels. And the camels were sturdy, they could carry up to 500 pounds each, and most importantly, they could survive the very, very harsh and cold conditions which were prevalent in the Asian deserts. So then the goods would go over those deserts, they would pass through several groups of middlemen, and ultimately they would end up on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. And by at least 100 BC, silk was known to the Romans, and they liked it. They became avid consumers of it. But interestingly enough, no direct contact seems to have been established between the governments of Rome and China. There is some evidence that the middlemen in the Silk Road trade, people such as the Parthians, actually deliberately tried to keep the two sides in ignorance of each other so that they could continue to profit from the trade by being the middle guys. The production of silk is sometimes credited with bringing huge amounts of currency to China. But producing silk is a labor-intensive thing. It's been estimated that to produce 150 pounds of silk, you have to have no fewer than 750,000 silkworms. And all those worms have to be cultivated, fed, and have their cages cleaned regularly. The economic prosperity of the Han Empire fostered both cultural and technological achievement. And especially impressive here are some of the new inventions and technologies that came out of this time. So, in keeping with the whole emphasis on bureaucracy and scholarship and the exams, it was during the Han era that true paper made from wood pulp, was first invented, probably around, the best guess is around 100 AD. Prior to that time in China, scribes had written on little strips of bamboo or wood, which sometimes were tied together to make kind of large sheets. But true paper was much lighter, it offered a bigger surface to write upon, and it was much more useful for recording documents and records and things like that. During the Han Dynasty, the forerunner of the newspaper may also have had its first appearance, or at least something that was a regularly published government bulletin. This was known as a tipao, and it would contain official announcements and sometimes little bits of news. Some of the other practically minded but still influential inventions which came out of Han China include the horse stirrup, the spinning wheel, the horse collar, which makes plowing more efficient, and the wheelbarrow, which lets you transport loads much more easily. In the realm of maritime science, this is a golden age for Chinese seafaring. Chinese ships are built with multiple masts, with true stern post rudders, that's a big innovation, and magnetic compasses. So all of these things were features of Chinese ships. Chinese scholars also made more, abstract advances, including calculating the value of pi in geometry, and also discovering the circulation of blood within the human body, which was something that was not realized in Europe until William Harvey worked on that in the 17th century. In the decorative arts, the type of fine porcelain, which today we just generically called china, was produced in this era as well. And Han artists crafted beautiful ceramic vessels and even pots shaped like animals out of this material. One particularly kind of neat invention of this time that combines both science and an element of artistry was a primitive seismograph for recording earthquakes. And this consisted of a big bronze vessel that had 8 bronze dragons around the lip of it, and they would react to any sort of vibration or tremor by dropping pearls from their mouths. One famous scholar of this time, who was a historian, astronomer, and mathematician, was also a woman. She was named Bon Chao, and she came from a famous family of other eminent scholars and also generals in the military. Atypical for women at the time, she received a fairly advanced education, and she's best known today for having authored a book which is called Lessons for Women. And this became a very influential text on the proper role of women in society. Now, in general, it pretty much reflects or embodies standard Confucian doctrine, which, as you might expect, emphasizes devotion and selfless behavior. Bon Chao accepted the traditional gender roles, and she stressed that a good wife should be modest, should obey her husband, and should do the tasks which were expected of her. So things like weaving and food preparation, which were stereotypically women's work. But on the other hand, she also said that women should be educated and that they should be respected. She said a harmonious marriage is the ultimate goal, but while a woman should be subservient, Bon Chao also believed that the ideal sort of harmony could best be achieved between intellectual equals. There's a famous passage in one of her books that says, "Humility means yielding and acting respectful, putting others first and oneself last. Industriousness means going to bed late, getting up early, never shirking work, morning or night, and completing everything that needs to be done neatly and carefully." The Han Dynasty can be broken up into 2 main phases. There's the early Han, sometimes called the Western Han, who ruled from 206 BC to 9 AD, and then there's the later, or Eastern Han, who ruled from about 25 to 220 AD. And during the 14-year gap between them, there were a whole bunch of really very colorful figures. This was a time of confusion, and a number of these people led popular uprisings. One of these was a rebel female leader named Mother Lu, who started out as a rich landowner, ended up as a pirate. There was another group of rebels who called themselves the Red Eyebrows, and they would actually paint their eyebrows red. And the idea here was that they were imitating demons which supposedly had red eyelids, and this was done to intimidate their enemies. Like Wu Ti, the later Han spent a lot of time and money and resources sending armies out to try and contain the Xiongnu, who are always an ever-present threat, and to try and bring back into the realm of China various border regions, again, like Vietnam, Korea, and Manchuria, that tend to break away during times of weakness or confusion. But those border regions also served as buffer zones. They protected China from invasion from external forces. And the Han stimulated trade with other states. They were an outward-looking dynasty. In the final decades of the later Han period, many of those same old problems, though, began to rear their heads once again. Too much taxation sparked peasant revolts. Constant intriguing at court weakened the central government. Generals started to break away and set themselves up as local warlords or kings. The northern barbarians got more aggressive and kept raiding the border regions. And all of this put a strain on the economy. Eventually, all these forces acted together and became overwhelming. And the last Han emperor abdicated the throne in 220 AD. All right, next we'll turn to the other great empire-building culture of the same time, the Romans, and we'll trace the course of their development from its humble beginnings up to a high point at which the Roman Empire rivals the Han Empire in size, in wealth, and in sophistication. Thank you.